Now a further reminder of those wartime days. Here's Jim O'Hagan.
Good afternoon, Walter. Very early in 1942, on the 26th of January to be precise, Northern Ireland was invaded, not by Germans, but by Americans, some 3,500 of them. On that day, Private Milburn Henke was the first US ordinary soldier to set foot on European soil as part of his country's contribution in the fight against the combined might of Hitler and his Japanese ally. Operation Magnet it was called. The Dufferin and Pollock docks in Belfast were the setting for the arrival of the first US contingent of troops, a commitment which grew to stationing approximately 120,000 personnel here in training camps by 1943, and which culminated in their part in the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944. They were called the Doughboys, many say, because of the distinctive headgear they wore. But before long the term could also have applied to their having and spending plenty of money with and on the local population. Many nationalities were represented in the contingent. There was even one Sioux Indian. Derry was also a port of early arrival of the US Marine Corps, and one local was struck by the silence of their march from the quayside there. They were wearing rubber-soled boots. James Kelly, in his splendid book of memoirs, Bonfires on the Hillside, recalls how he interviewed Private Henke soon after the troops arrived to a very enthusiastic welcome and to the sound of the Star-Spangled Banner. He asked Henke, who was the son of a German pastry cook from Minnesota, why he had the honour of being picked to be the first man ashore. Henke replied that he just happened to be at the head of the queue awaiting disembarkation and was pushed off. Henke later became famous and received bags of fan mail and offers of marriage. His young brother, back home when told, said, "I always knew he'd be famous." The pay and allowances, Walter, which the Americans received were very generous for the times. Sergeants, I understand, got $100 a month, which was approximately 4 times what the British Tommy of equivalent rank got. Out of his approximately 26 shillings per week, the British soldier paid for his own cigarettes, laundry, cups of canteen tea, shoe repairs and other necessities. By contrast, the US soldiers, or GIs, as they were also known by, were given a monthly parcel of Camel cigarettes, sweets, of which Hershey bars are remembered to this day, chewing gum and toiletries, and were very popular with the local girls. Generally, the GIs were free spenders, often giving their female acquaintances presents of nylon stockings, which were most coveted. The GIs were very glamorous to many women at the time and appeared somewhat like movie stars with their drawling accents. They exuded confidence with remarks like, "We're going to finish this guy Hitler off mighty quick, or we lick his pants off." Their phenomenal appeal was understandable in the grim era of rationing, and many women changed their style of dress and presentation as a result. The local girls started to wear their hair on top of their heads, often held in place by flowers. Skirt and dress hems changed from mid-calf to half an inch above the knee. Many women at this time used lotion to suntan their legs and wore Carmen Miranda Cuban-heeled shoes. Getting nylons enabled them to dispense with the lotion. The pubs, clubs and restaurants did a roaring trade in Belfast. The American Red Cross was set up in Chichester Street, the Embassy in Queen Street and the Manhattan Club in Cornmarket for US officers were other popular haunts. The Plaza Ballroom in Chichester Street and the Ulster Hall were patronised hugely by the dancing GIs and their girlfriends. One funny story I remember concerns the Manhattan and Corn Market. Shortly after the war, these premises were taken over by the Belfast Christian Brothers Past Pupils Union. Whilst it was being renovated, the committee members were often bothered by knocks on the door in the evenings by ladies of dubious repute, who had previously frequented the place when the Americans were there. To get rid of the girls, the committee men told them the place had been taken over by a religious order. At this, the girls promptly left. Many US soldiers initially thought, when they went out on their sprees, that the Irish colleens they would meet up with would be rather light-headed and silly, and whilst a proportion were, some were definitely not. These girls conned their escorts, and the story is told of one who ran off with the US boyfriend's monthly parcel of cigarettes as he was getting his coat in the cloakroom of a dance hall. Another girl, whilst dining with her doughboy, stole the tips he left for the servers on the tables. Some of the girls had nicknames amongst the GIs. One was known as Electric Lizzie, another was Moonlight Maggie. Walter, to many in Northern Ireland at the time, whilst grateful for their potential as an ally, the doughboy's presence took a lot of getting used to. One veteran reporter of the social scene was quoted as saying that Belfast would never be the same again, and this was in the early days of their stay. One American gent was heard asking in a pub for a pint of that Bushmills beer. In those days, pubs were closed on Sundays, but this did not deter keen drinkers, and many pubs and shebeens in areas near the Belfast city centre did remarkable business on Sabbath days. A common remark was they're overpaid, oversexed and overhere. Although wartime marriages were not encouraged by either the US authorities or local clergy, many in fact took place, some 1,800 in all. Due to rationing, the ladies' wedding outfits were often make-do affairs. A relative of mine, as a bridesmaid, used dyed army blankets stitched together and restyled as a coat dress. The bride was dressed similarly, but in a different colour. Hats were not rationed, so the headgear was often elaborate. Many of these marriages were very successful, but quite a few were not, and some girls were left high and dry. These were the single parents of nameless children, poor girls from respectable homes, either married but deserted or seduced with a marriage promise. The story is told of a parish priest in South Down who asked one intending GI bridegroom to get a letter of freedom from his priest back home, stating he was free to marry. The soldier apparently replied with, "Father, what's the fuss about? It's only a wartime marriage." Needless to say, the clergyman ordered him out of the parochial house. One of the victims of this type of disgraceful behaviour said that when she went to her fiancé's army camp, she found he had already left the day after her seduction. She returned shocked to a shamed family. When contingents of the troops were shipped off to North Africa, some brides were left behind and abandoned, often with a small child or children. Also, for those who eventually joined their husbands in the US after the war, many suffered hardship on the journey, which usually took place aboard converted naval vessels with hammocks for beds and no running hot water facilities. When they got to America, a lot of them found it wasn't a land of milk and honey. One woman found herself sharing a 16-foot-long hut with the rest of her husband's family. Another, whose husband had given the impression he was a millionaire, found he was a soda jerker, the American description of one who mixed lemonade in a mineral water factory. As the number of US troops expanded with the opening of naval and air bases, many American VIPs paid whistle-stop visits to the province. Glenn Miller, the legendary entertainer, played the plaza with his famous band, whilst top brass Army and Air Force generals used Langford Lodge and Toome aerodromes regularly. Other celebs here at the time included Joe Louis and Bob Hope. Incidentally, this very evening a church service takes place to commemorate the opening of the Langford Lodge base. It's at Gartree Church, Loughney. The US Army had a very impressive public relations corps led by a Colonel Arters based in Linnenhall Street in Belfast. Many local newspaper men were invited to sorties, that is, to interview some of the high-ranking commanders and be part of the news scene. The Belfast Telegraph printed the weekly Stars and Stripes for the forces over here. One such sortie, attended by James Kelly, was not very pleasant, however. This was a court-martial in a village hall in Castlewellan in County Down, which was concerned with the murder of a deaf-mute girl. Kelly vividly describes one of the murder exhibits, the blood-stained bed of the victim. Reading his account reminded me of the Perry Mason-type TV series of some years ago. Eventually, the US soldier involved was found guilty and deported back home to serve a life sentence. With the influx of so many free spenders, Walter, on the scene here, many local con men had a field day, anxious to make a quick killing. Much black marketing went on, often for dubious alcohol. It would be wrong to give the impression that every American serviceman who was here during the war was irresponsible or a cad, drinking and swanning his years away. Many were of the highest calibre, who later distinguished themselves in the European theatre of war, and indeed a lot gave their lives for the Allied cause. Even some of the cads turned into good, brave soldiers and paid the supreme price too. As I've said, many local characters took advantage of some gullible young GIs. My father remembered how one evening in Crummock Square he saw a black American paying an exorbitant price, £3, for a so-called bottle of whiskey. The con man scarpered with the GI hot on his heels up Crummock Street after the soldier had taken a gulp of the stuff. God knows what the bottle really contained. My father said the GI was wielding a large knife, but he did not catch the seller. Another story tells of a similar incident when a so-called bottle of scotch was sold to a doughboy who was suspicious of its contents. The bottle was sent to the public analyst, who reported, "This horse's kidneys are out of order and need the attention of a vet." Apocryphal or not, this story, albeit humorous, illustrates the dangers that these young men put themselves in by mixing in the blackout with harpies on the make. The local dance halls soon became well subscribed with jitterbugging GIs. Incidentally, I read somewhere that one of their main dog mascots was called Jitterbug. Petrol, as you know, Walter, became very scarce, and this resulted in horse-drawn cabs and jaunting cars reappearing on the streets. No doubt many of the Yanks who were Irish Americans would have been charmed by this. This form of transport was much used, but again some local sharks got in on the act and charged very high prices. One evening a row broke out near the Ulster Hall, which resulted in something of a pitched battle developing between drivers and protesting GIs. The fight was carried into the dance floor of the hall, where the Jarvies with whips brandished demanded payment of their fares. Another of these drivers at the time made legal history by being prosecuted for running a brothel on wheels. There were black troops in the camps, and this fact caused problems to some extent. One such incident was called the Battle of Antrim, which occurred over a black GI dancing with a white girl. The row and rumpus was quelled only with the arrival on the scene of a black general. Another incident in Belfast had a strong element of farce about it. It concerned a fracas in a cafe in York Street, where an RUC sergeant hit a coloured soldier who had gone completely mad. The GI was hit on the head with a baton, but it seemed to have no effect, for he merely said, "I'll get you for that." And with that, razor in hand, he chased the policeman to the door. He slit the policeman's raincoat across the back so deeply that the man's braces were severed as well, resulting in his trousers falling down. In the nick of time, the US military police arrived. They were called the Dewdrops. They shouted to the RUC men, who by this time were involved in an all-out brawl with several GIs, "Go for their ankles. It's no use hitting their skulls. They're too hard." Such were the types of incidents occurring, and reading back over them across the years, the hilarity they produced in the reader is striking. Yet another occurrence reflected the tough tactics of the Dewdrops, who had the reputation of hitting first and asking questions afterwards. One evening late, the manager of a city cinema found a US technician asleep in the cinema's cafe. He could not be wakened and seemed drunk. The manager phoned the US military police, and after a few minutes' wait, a jeep arrived and 3 Dewdrops roused in with clubs, inquiring where the troublemaker was. The manager assured them that the man was giving no trouble, but was merely asleep. They ignored this advice and hauled the unfortunate roughly down the stairs and sent him crashing into the back of the jeep, and away they went. I'm sure he had a rude awakening. All these events happened before my time, Walter. My only vague recollection is of the military evacuation of the Ormeau Park in Belfast, which had been one of their bases, and of all the trucks, etc., rumbling down the Ormeau Road and into the city centre to the docks, past my home. Quite a few local men became very jealous of the GI's success with the local girls in pockets of the city. They were barred from pubs and clubs. I understand this happened for a time in the D Street area of the Newtownards Road, but it happened in other areas too. Political and religious controversy was stirred by the Minister of Home Affairs at the time, William Lowry, the brother-in-law of Robert Lynn, the distinguished Belfast-born essayist. Lowry allowed the use of an Orange Hall for a celebration of the Mass for US Catholic servicemen. Many in the Orange Order questioned this gesture. In reply, Lowry's remark that the hall could always be fumigated after it had been so used infuriated Catholics who called for his resignation. Walter, the constraints of time have forced me to concentrate mainly on the happenings of the GIs in the Belfast area. However, they were billeted in other areas around the province where, like Belfast, they felt they had been generally very well received, especially the coloured soldiers amongst them. In Carrickmore, County Tyrone, a funny situation arose where after a fracas between coloured and white soldiers, the pubs in the town displayed notices for a time to the effect that only coloured GIs would be served. Shades here of the reverse discrimination. In Derry, a film has been completed very recently called Proudly We Served, about the exploits down the years of the US Marine Corps. It is due to be released next February and contains much material about the Marine Corps' time in the Maiden City during the war years. That should be worth watching. Thus ends my talk today about, as many people still call it, the time the Americans were here. A time that will always be remembered for the colour the GIs brought to the local scene, the allure they had for many, especially the girls, and the courage they later displayed on the battlefields of Europe. For some, these memories are rather bittersweet, no doubt, but all would agree, I'm sure, that for good or bad, like them or loathe them, the doughboys will never be forgotten.
Jim O'Hagan recalling the time the doughboys came to town. And here's another Glenn Miller reminder of the time, which would have created some interest in this part of the world. Danny Boy, the Londonderry air played by the Glenn Miller Orchestra. I'm sure Glenn Miller played that when the band appeared here, because the recording, made in 1940, predates his Northern Ireland appearances at the Plaza and at Langford Lodge.